Jealousy. Come on, it's just not fair. It's not right to each other. Jail? What is your plan? You gonna go to jail?
On the night of July 6th into July 7th, 2022, in Chicago's Uptown neighborhood, 38-year-old Tyson Tillman threw 31-year-old Tabitha Tanner out the fifth-floor window of his own apartment on North Magnolia Avenue. She died instantly. Her body lay naked in a dark alley behind the building for almost 7 hours before random passers-by stumbled onto it. In this video, we're breaking down what drove a man to that kind of brutality and why, even after he essentially confessed to the killing on camera, he walked free the moment his sentence was read. By the time he turned 38, Tyson Tillman had spent a large chunk of his life inside the criminal justice system. He graduated from Collins High School and later from Lakeland College. On paper, that makes him a more educated man than most of his peers, and his defense would go on to remind the court of that fact more than once, framing him not as some random street criminal, but as someone capable of reasoning through his choices and owning the consequences. But that same biography has another side to it. Starting in 2003, Tillman racked up 8 prior convictions, the overwhelming majority tied to drug offenses. 8 convictions in under 20 years isn't a single misstep. It's a way of life stretched across 2 decades. Every time, he got out and went right back to the same neighborhood, the same social circle, the same circumstances that kept pulling him back behind bars. That kind of record paints the picture of a man for whom prison had stopped being some exceptional event and had become a recurring backdrop to his life, and who, despite that, kept ending up right back where he started. By the summer of 2022, Tillman was living on the 4,500 block of North Magnolia Avenue, right in the heart of Uptown, a north side Chicago neighborhood long known for its mixed, often lower-income housing stock and a heavy concentration of social problems. It's a place where old apartment buildings sit next to drug corners and social service offices, and where crime statistics have stayed above the city average for years. Court records would later document psychiatric diagnoses for Tillman, for which he was receiving medical treatment even while in custody. But exactly what those diagnoses were, or when they were made, isn't specified in open sources. A long history of convictions, mostly drug-related, combined with officially documented psychiatric issues, is a combination that shows up often in backgrounds like this one. But on its own, it doesn't prove or directly explain anything about what happened later that summer night. It's just one piece of the picture that has to be assembled from fragments. The combination of a college degree and 8 criminal convictions creates a contradictory portrait on its own. This isn't an uneducated man who stumbled off track by accident. It's a man who had the formal means for a different path in life, and who, year after year, ended up back in the same system anyway. At the time of his arrest, according to his attorney, Tillman was expecting a child. That same defense would go on to claim he lived alone, a detail meant, at his bail hearing, to work in his favor, presenting him as someone with an orderly, independent life, awaiting fatherhood. But that claim sits awkwardly against what appears to have actually been happening in his apartment that night, and against the fact that, by all appearances, there wasn't just one woman in his life, but at least 2. Far less is known about Tabitha Tanner. She was 31. Neither her profession, where she grew up, nor whether she had family, kids, or people she went home to each night appears anywhere in the court record or in any published press report. The only confirmed fact of her life available today is that late in the evening on July 6th, she showed up at Tillman's apartment on North Magnolia Avenue.
Or you're going to... like something bad is gonna happen. What fate do you have?
That silence in the sources isn't just a technical gap. It's part of the tragedy of this story. A woman whose death drew coverage from Chicago's biggest news outlets, whose name was argued over in courtrooms and social media, remained almost completely faceless to the public. The press quoted the defendant's own words at length, dug into his criminal record, published photos from the crime scene, but said next to nothing about who the woman he killed actually was.
Also, be very mindful of who you leave your kids with. Do not leave your kids with just anybody.
There was a third person in this story too. A woman's sources refer to simply as Tillman's girlfriend. Her name is never disclosed anywhere, and her role in this story only becomes clear later, that same night when she walks into the same building on North Magnolia Avenue. For now, what matters is simply establishing that she existed in Tillman's orbit, because her presence in the defendant's life is what the prosecution's only theory of what happened would eventually rest on. who this woman was to Tillman, how long-standing or stable her relationship with him actually was, and whether she even knew Tabitha Tanner existed in his life at all. None of these questions are answered in open sources. This is where documented fact ends and speculation begins, and that line needs to be drawn as clearly as possible. Court records never directly characterize the nature of the relationship between Tillman and Tanner. It's never stated whether she was his partner, a casual acquaintance, or someone tied to him through something far briefer and less defined. Prosecutor James O'Connor, who presented the state's case at the bail hearing, would later state outright that the prosecution wasn't putting forward any official theory of motive. That silence is worth noting on its own. Prosecutors typically try to build as clear a picture as possible, to name a cause, to lay out the defendant's logic for a jury. That doesn't happen here. Not in July 2022, and, as far as anyone can tell, not later either. Still, there are circumstantial details worth considering. If Tillman really was involved with both Tabitha Tanner and the woman sources call his girlfriend at the same time, the evening of July 6th might have been the moment those two parallel threads of his life collided in one place, one apartment, one narrow window of time. Was it pure coincidence, the girlfriend simply showing up at a bad moment? Was there some kind of arrangement, some regular visiting schedule that happened to break down that particular night? Or did Tanner herself end up in that apartment more or less by chance, for the first time, with neither she nor Tillman expecting the evening to turn into anything more than an ordinary visit? None of the available sources answer any of these questions. There's a different, less obvious reading of the situation too. Nothing in the available material proves the relationship between Tillman and Tanner was necessarily romantic or intimate at all. She could have been an acquaintance, a neighbor, someone from the same social circle who'd stopped by for an entirely ordinary reason. If that's the case, the girlfriend's arrival that same evening would have had nothing to do with the defendant's personal relationship with the woman who died. It would simply have been an unfortunate coincidence, two visits that happened to overlap in time. The problem is that neither version is backed by anything beyond the logic of the timeline itself.
Jealousy. Come on, it's just not fair. It's not right to each other. It's not humane to do something like that.
The prosecution's official position leans toward infidelity as the backdrop to what happened, but the prosecutor himself, as already noted, declined to call it a motive outright. It's worth asking the question a different way too. Why was the nature of the relationship between Tillman and Tanner never officially established? Maybe no witness could say with any confidence what they were to each other. Maybe Tanner herself was someone that even the people around her knew too little about, and there was simply no one available who could speak to what they had. Or maybe the prosecution deliberately chose not to dig into that question, since proving it wasn't necessary to secure a conviction. What mattered far more was proving the physical act of violence itself, not untangling the nature of the relationship between the people involved. Each of these explanations is plausible in its own way, and none of them is documented. It remains an open question, one worth returning to later, once more details come into view. Before we go further, if this case has your attention, hit that like button. It tells us these are the stories worth telling. Subscribe so you don't miss the next investigation. And drop a comment. What's your read on this case so far? Now, back to it. What happened in the alley behind the building on North Magnolia Avenue that night ended up captured by several independent surveillance systems, none of which were coordinated with each other. An exterior camera pointed at the alley apparently belonged to one of the owners of a neighboring building, and normally only caught trash bins and the occasional pedestrian cutting between streets. Video doorbells installed by Tillman's neighbors on his floor typically only capture whoever approaches their own doors. But that night, one of those doorbells happened to record not its own owner, but a woman pacing the hallway, waiting for someone to open a door that wasn't hers. None of these devices were aimed specifically at Tillman's apartment. Each one accidentally caught only a fragment of what happened, and only pieced together do those fragments offer any real picture of that night's timeline. The building on the 4,500 block of North Magnolia Avenue is an ordinary 5-story apartment building, one of dozens like it in Uptown. Nothing about its facade sets it apart from the buildings around it. Behind it, between the rows of houses, runs a narrow alley, the kind that backs onto apartment windows and serves as a spot for trash pickup. It was that backside of the building, invisible from the street, that would become the center of events that night. Events that would completely upend several lives. On the evening of July 6th, 2022, surveillance cameras recorded the first movement in this timeline. At 10:09 p.m., Tyson Tillman approaches his building and goes inside. There's nothing unusual about the moment itself. A man coming home late on a weekday night, something he'd probably done hundreds of times before. The camera at the entrance catches his silhouette. And based on available footage, that's where the visual record stops. Nothing that happens inside the apartment over the following minutes was captured on any camera. This marks the first of several gaps in the night's timeline that can only be guessed at. About 38 minutes later, around 10:47 p.m., a woman sources describe as Tillman's girlfriend approaches the same building. She goes inside. From that point on, her movements are picked up not just by the building's exterior cameras, but by the doorbell cameras belonging to Tillman's neighbors on the same floor. Devices installed by residents for their own safety, which that night would accidentally become witnesses to someone else's tragedy. Footage from those cameras shows the woman doesn't go straight into the apartment. She paces the hallway outside Tillman's door for at least 10 minutes, from roughly 10:47 to 10:57 p.m. The footage doesn't answer whether she knocked, called his phone, or tried to get his attention some other way. By all appearances, no one opens the door for her. She simply walks back and forth in the narrow hallway of the apartment building, a few feet from a door behind which at that exact moment is a man she has some kind of relationship with, and a woman whose existence she may not even suspect. This is the only stretch of the entire story where two separate timelines, what's happening in the hallway and what's happening inside the apartment, run side by side, separated only by a thin door and a few feet of space. What was happening behind that door during those 10 minutes is something we can only speculate about. No source, no camera, no document offers a direct answer. At 10:59 p.m., an exterior camera set up in the alley behind the building captures the moment this entire timeline has been building toward. Tabitha Tanner's naked body falls from the 5th floor window and hits the ground. Based on available data, no more than 2 minutes pass between the point where the woman in the hallway, by all appearances, stops pacing and the moment the body falls. These two episodes, the waiting outside the door and the fall, converge on almost the exact same point in time. No camera captured the moment right before the fall. What happened inside the apartment in the instant before Tanner's body went out the window. That gap would go on to become the central point of every dispute about what actually happened. Was this a deliberate, targeted act of violence, or the result of some other sequence of events inside the apartment that simply had no one there to record it? Based solely on the camera timeline, one thing can be said for certain. A woman fell from a 5th-story window without clothing in a 2-minute window that opened immediately after another woman had been standing at the front door of that same apartment. The condition Tanner's body was in when it went out that window deserves attention on its own. She was completely naked. That fact alone, captured by the camera in the alley, adds one more element to an already sparse picture, one that has no precise explanation at this stage. A fall from the 5th floor of a Chicago apartment building is a height that leaves almost no chance of survival. A body falling from that distance reaches a speed high enough that impact with the hard surface of the alley below is fatal almost instantly. Medical evidence later presented in the case would document multiple injuries consistent with a fall from significant height, injuries affecting nearly every system in the body. But death itself, by all appearances, came within seconds of impact, if not immediately. The alley behind the building at that hour, close to 11 at night, is empty. No pedestrians, no chance witnesses, no neighbors out walking dogs. Just asphalt, trash bins, and the back walls of buildings whose windows by that hour are mostly already dark. Later, once this case caught the attention of journalists, a separate review of the Cook County Medical Examiner's archives would reveal, since 2014, the year that database begins, there have been 8 other recorded deaths from falls from height, some of them tied to people fleeing deliberately set fires. Tabitha Tanner's death would become only the second case in that entire database specifically involving a person being thrown from a window. This particular method of killing is statistically rare on its own, which makes what happened in that alley behind North Magnolia Avenue an outlier even against the city's already grim numbers. At 11:03 p.m., 4 minutes after the fall, a different exterior camera picks up a new figure in the scene. A man in a red shirt walking out of the building and approaching the body lying in the alley. He stops next to it. The camera shows him examining the body, but nothing beyond that. No attempt to help, no call to emergency services, None of the actions you'd normally expect from someone who just discovered a badly injured or dead person right outside their own home. He simply stands there, looks, and then, after a short time, turns around. At 11:11 p.m., the same camera captures the man in the red shirt going back into the building, the same place he'd come out of minutes earlier. The door closes behind him. From that point on, for the next several hours, nothing happens in the alley behind the North Magnolia Avenue building that gets picked up by any of the cameras involved in this case. Tabitha Tanner's body remains exactly where it landed, in a dark, empty alley, out of sight of any passers-by, in a spot no one would come across until morning. The morning of July 7th, 2022, began in Uptown like any other weekday summer morning. The neighborhood slowly wakes up, people rushing to work, walking dogs, stepping out for their morning coffee. The alley behind the North Magnolia Avenue building, usually empty at that early hour, shouldn't have looked any different that morning from hundreds of other alleys in the neighborhood. But at 6:11 a.m., someone passing through the 4500 block of North Malden Street, literally the next street over from Tillman's building, notices something that doesn't belong in an alley between residential buildings. That person's identity is never disclosed anywhere. What's known is only what they did next. They called 911. That call to dispatch is how emergency responders, police, and soon the entire city press first learned this case existed. Paramedics arrived on scene at 6:30 a.m. They confirmed what, given the nature of her injuries, was apparently obvious at first glance. The woman was dead. Tabitha Tanner was pronounced dead at the scene, in the very alley where her body had lain alone for the previous 7 hours. Detectives arrived within minutes of paramedics declaring her dead. For Chicago police, who deal with violent deaths across the city on a daily basis, a call about a body in an alley is a routine, if consistently serious, procedure. But the scale of the response to this particular case matched the severity of what had happened. A woman's naked body, lying in a residential alley for hours, points to a violent death on its own, even before any additional details come to light. The case moved from an ordinary call to a homicide investigation almost immediately, skipping past the period of ambiguity that, under other circumstances, might have slowed down the first hours of the investigation. Standard procedure in cases like this involves interviewing residents of nearby buildings, searching the area for surveillance cameras, and identifying the victim. Based on what happened next, detectives arrived at the North Magnolia Avenue building fairly quickly, likely working from the geography of where the body was found and the presence of cameras capable of capturing what happened in the alley. Tyson Tillman, who lived in that building, was among the first people police made contact with. In his first conversation with officers at the scene, Tillman said he didn't know anything about what had happened. He didn't mention any woman, any argument, anything that would connect him to the body in the alley. On its face, for someone claiming no connection to what happened, that's a fairly expected answer. The problem is that it directly contradicted material investigators already had. The same exterior camera that had captured the moment the body fell had also captured a man in a red shirt walking out to the body minutes later, examining it and returning to the building. The detectives conducting the interview, by all appearances, already had that footage in hand at that point, or at least knew it existed. The gap between what Tillman said and what the video showed became the starting point for the rest of the conversation. Investigators didn't stop at his first answer and kept questioning him. Pressing for a second, more thorough round of questioning is a standard investigative tactic, and in this case, it produced results. Tillman changed his story. In the second version he gave investigators, Tillman admitted Tanner really had come to his apartment that evening. He said the two of them got into a physical altercation. He claimed her clothes came off during that altercation, and he stated that she fell out of the window. That phrasing is notable for how completely it sidesteps the question of what actually caused the fall, whether it was a fight that turned into a shove, a loss of balance during a struggle, or something else entirely. The word fell, in his own version, implies an absence of direct intent, without denying that some kind of physical confrontation had taken place between him and Tanner shortly before her death. It's worth noting separately that none of Tillman's known accounts ever mention his girlfriend, the woman who, according to neighboring doorbell footage, spent at least 10 minutes in the hallway outside his door shortly before the body fell. Whether she was simply left out of his retelling by accident, or whether he deliberately excluded her from his version of events, can't be established from available information. Alongside questioning Tillman, police also took action regarding the girlfriend herself. She was taken into custody around the same time. shortly after news of what happened became known. Detention under circumstances like this is standard procedure. Anyone whose presence at the scene of a potential crime is captured on camera automatically becomes someone police need to talk to. Unlike Tillman though, she was never charged with anything. Her role in what happened, by all appearances, was limited to exactly what the doorbell cameras showed. She stood in the hallway and waited. By the time police had fully mobilized at the scene, the alley behind the North Magnolia Avenue building had stopped being the quiet, unremarkable space it had been all night. Patrol cars, yellow tape, uniformed officers, everything that turns an ordinary residential backyard into a crime scene, drew the attention of the few residents already awake at that hour. Discovering a body without clothing automatically triggers an additional protocol within an investigation. Police initiate a forensic examination for evidence of sexual assault. The victim's nudity on its own, regardless of what actually explains it, becomes a circumstance investigators are required to check first, since confirming or ruling out that possibility has to happen at the earliest possible stage before relevant evidence can be lost or degraded. Neither the results of that examination nor any subsequent reference to them ever appear in any of the published materials on this case. Tillman was taken into custody at 10:29 a.m. on July 7th, roughly 4 hours after the body was discovered by a passerby, and about 12 hours after the fall itself. After his arrest, Tillman was taken to the police station for booking. It was during that stage, while the standard intake procedure was underway, fingerprinting, paperwork, waiting inside the station, that an episode occurred whose full significance at the time probably wasn't clear to anyone, including Tillman himself. A body camera worn by one of the officers nearby kept running, exactly as standard protocol requires for these devices. And at some point, it captured Tillman on the phone with someone on the other end of the line. The device recorded exactly what Tillman said in that call, start to finish. A man who had just told investigators a story about an accidental fall during an argument in this same moment, while being recorded, said something entirely different to someone he apparently trusted enough not to choose his words carefully. That recording, made almost by accident, in the routine setting of a booking procedure, Praca Pudo and Libixion Pashichi, would become one of the most significant pieces of evidence in the entire case, and the detail around which much of the prosecution's case would ultimately be built. On July 8, 2022, Tillman was formally charged, not with involuntary manslaughter, and not with domestic violence resulting in a tragic death, but with first-degree murder. That's the most serious charge available to Illinois state prosecutors, and the fact that it was filed shows just how seriously investigators viewed the evidence gathered by that point, chiefly the surveillance footage and the phone call captured on body camera. The charge set the bar for the rest of the proceedings, not simply proving Tillman's role in Tanner's death, but proving conscious, premeditated intent to kill her. On Sunday, July 10th, a bail hearing was held. Judge Mary Marubio presided. Assistant State's Attorney James O'Connor represented the prosecution, and it was at this hearing that the full timeline of that night's events was first laid out publicly, pieced together from 4 independent video sources: the neighbor's doorbell cameras, the building's internal cameras, the exterior camera in the alley, and the officer's body camera. What had, just days earlier, existed as scattered, disconnected fragments captured by unrelated devices was now, for the first time, assembled into a single, coherent account presented in court. For an outside observer sitting in the courtroom or watching the broadcast, this timeline offered the first chance to see the entire night laid out from start to finish, from Tillman's arrival at the building to the moment he disappeared back through his door after examining the body in the alley. It was here, before the judge and a small public audience, that the contents of that phone call, the one the body camera had accidentally recorded back at the station during booking, were made public for the first time. According to O'Connor, while in custody and talking on the phone, Tillman said something that would go on to become the central piece of evidence in the entire case. He told the person on the other end of the line that he'd thrown her out the window. The word he used leaves no room for accident. Not fell, not went out, through. An active, deliberate act, carried out by his own hand. A bail hearing isn't a trial on the merits of a case. It's simply a formal procedure to determine whether a defendant stays in custody pending trial or is released on bond. But hearings like this are also the first place the defense gets a chance to publicly challenge the prosecution's logic. And Tillman's court-appointed attorney did exactly that, arguing that the evidence gathered so far wasn't enough to establish intentional murder. In her words, there were no other witnesses to what happened, no footage of the actual moment the woman went out the window, and the medical examiner's findings, in her view, didn't allow anyone to say with confidence at this stage whether the injuries were the result of a deliberate push or an accidental fall during a struggle. On paper, that's a reasonable procedural argument. The absence of a direct eyewitness to the fall itself is an objective fact, not a defense tactic. Judge Marubio didn't agree. Weighing the evidence presented as a whole, the video timeline, the nature of the injuries, the phrase police captured from the phone call, she concluded that the violent nature of the crime and the callous manner in which the defendant had apparently confessed to it left her no conditions she could set to protect the public from further violence on his part. At the bail hearing, no bond was set for Tillman. He remained in custody through trial. Alongside that ruling, the court also granted a request to provide Tillman with medical care related to the psychiatric diagnoses his defense had raised, a rare instance of a single hearing applying both the harshest possible restriction on a defendant's freedom and at the same time an element of care for his health. The bail hearing was live-streamed on a video platform, an unusual detail for a routine criminal bail hearing. That broadcast, along with the phone call phrase that spread through the press, set the tone for how this case would be covered in the media for years to come. What follows in this case is a long pause, a stretch spanning several years, during which Tillman remained in custody, awaiting trial on the underlying charge. Cook County's court system, one of the busiest in the country, has spent years processing a backlog of thousands of criminal cases, and the gap between a formal charge and the actual start of a jury trial often runs not months, but years. Tabitha Tanner's case was no exception to that pattern. While the case crawled through the system, Tillman remained behind bars the entire time. When the case finally reached trial, Judge Michael Clancy presided. The prosecution had to convince 12 jurors of something they'd been confident of from the very beginning, that Tillman's actions weren't a tragic accident, but a deliberate murder. Jurors were shown the full body of evidence gathered over those years, surveillance footage from the building and the alley, the recording of the phone call from the police station, autopsy results, and materials related to the discovery of the body. The Cook County medical examiner established the precise nature of the injuries that caused Tabitha Tanner's death: a broken shin bone, craniofacial trauma, and a ruptured heart. Injuries consistent with a body absorbing massive impact force in the fall from a fifth-story window. Her death was officially ruled a homicide. That evidence, presented to the jury in court, provides the fullest medical picture available today of what happened to Tabitha Tanner's body at the moment of impact in the alley behind the North Magnolia Avenue building. Jurors had to reach a decision on a charge of first-degree murder, a category that requires proving not just the defendant's role in a death, but the presence of direct intent to kill at the moment the act was committed. That's a high evidentiary bar, and it's exactly where the defense built its entire case. Even if Tillman really did push Tanner out that window, the prosecution had no direct proof that, in that specific moment, he acted with intent to kill her, rather than, say, intent to cause harm in the middle of a fight that had spiraled out of control. The distinction between these two legal categories isn't just a matter of legal wording. First-degree murder in Illinois carries a sentence measured in decades, and often a life sentence. Involuntary manslaughter is a significantly lighter charge, meant for cases where death results from reckless, but not deliberately lethal, conduct. For the jurors hearing this case, the difference between these two verdicts effectively came down to a single question. What was going on in Tillman's mind during those few seconds no camera ever captured? With no direct evidence to answer that question, jurors had to work it out through a chain of circumstantial evidence, including that exact phrase, spoken over the phone inside the police station. The jury doesn't convict Tillman of first-degree murder. Instead, they return a verdict on a significantly lesser charge: involuntary manslaughter, a category that requires acknowledging Tillman really did cause Tanner's death, but doesn't establish that he intended to kill her in the moment she went out the window. For the prosecution, which had pushed for a conviction on the most serious charge available, this outcome falls well short of what they'd originally sought. For the defense, it's a partial but significant win. A defendant who confessed to what he did in his own words, caught on camera, avoided a charge carrying a far harsher potential sentence. What exactly tipped the jury toward that decision? Which specific defense arguments proved more persuasive than the prosecution's can't be determined from published materials. Jury deliberations happen behind closed doors. All that can be assumed is that the absence of any direct footage of the moment of the fall The exact gap the defense pointed to from the start likely played a decisive role. The defendant's own words, captured on camera at the station, turned out to be weighty enough evidence to establish his role in Tanner's death, but apparently not weighty enough to prove intent to kill in the specific legal sense of that term. That's only an inference drawn from the logic of the verdict itself, not from any direct account of the jury's deliberations. In December 2025, less than a month after the jury's verdict, Judge Michael Clancy handed down the official sentence. Tillman was sentenced to 5 years in prison, the term set by state law for involuntary manslaughter. But by the time that sentence was read, Tillman had already been in custody for 1,247 days, dating back to his arrest in July 2022. That entire stretch counted fully against the sentence he'd just received. Judge Clancy's sentence, handed down in December 2025, meant, in practical terms, one thing. Tyson Tillman walked free almost immediately after that sentence was read aloud. A man who confessed to what he did in his own words, caught on a police station body camera, left the courtroom not as a convicted man about to begin serving his sentence, but as someone whose punishment had already been fully served. For Tabitha Tanner's family, and for everyone who'd followed this case over 3.5 years, that's exactly how it ended. Fast, procedural, and, in the view of many, wildly out of proportion to what happened in that alley behind the building on North Magnolia Avenue. The reaction from Tanner's family and the broader public to this outcome, based on published material, was close to unanimous. Disagreement with the fact that a man whose own words formed the basis of the case against him walked free just a few years after a woman's death. For anyone who believed Tanner's death was the result of a deliberate, targeted act rather than a tragic accident, an outcome like this looks like a clear mismatch between the severity of what happened and the severity of the punishment that followed. Judging by the tone of public commentary, Tillman's own criminal history played a real role in that sense of injustice. For a lot of observers, the 8 prior convictions leading up to this case became one more argument that a 5-year sentence, effectively already served by the time it was handed down, didn't match either the severity of what he'd done or the kind of man he'd shown himself to be. The fate of the woman sources referred to as Tillman's girlfriend, the same woman who spent at least 10 minutes in the hallway outside his door the night Tanner died, remains completely unknown today. She was detained in the first hours after the incident became known, but was never charged with anything. What happened in her life afterward, whether she was ever called as a witness at trial, how she herself views her role in this chain of events, none of these questions are answered in open sources. Open sources also offer nothing about Tillman's current whereabouts or circumstances since his release, beyond the bare fact that he walked free on time already served. This case's media footprint turned out to be far longer than the trial itself. Within days of the arrest, in July 2022, the case drew heavy coverage from Chicago's biggest outlets, the Chicago Tribune, the Chicago Sun-Times, and Fox 32. Chicago all published stories within roughly the same window, each one consistently centered on the same detail: the phrase Tillman spoke on the phone inside the police station. That phrase, more than the timeline of events itself, became the hook around which almost all of the early media coverage of this case was built. And yet, despite all the attention this case received, a number of key questions were never answered. The nature of the relationship between Tillman and Tanner was never officially established by either investigators or the court. It's never stated whether she was his partner, a casual acquaintance, or someone with some other, less clearly defined connection to the defendant. A motive for the crime, if one ever existed in the sense criminal law typically requires, was never officially named. Prosecutor James O'Connor stated outright at the bail hearing that the prosecution wasn't putting forward a theory of motive, and all the speculation about jealousy or panic over the girlfriend's return, which circulated in unofficial sources and on social media, remained just that: speculation, never backed by an official position from the prosecution. Across 3.5 years of proceedings, at no stage of the process, not at the bail hearing, not at the jury trial, did the prosecution ever see fit to officially close that question. The results of the forensic examination for sexual assault, initiated by police immediately after the naked body was found, never appear in any available source. Whether that exam confirmed or ruled out that possibility, its findings remain entirely outside the public record on this case.
Office for info on free speech therapy. Thank you so much. God bless.
Tabitha Tanner lived 31 years, a life the public never really learned anything about, beyond her age and the circumstances of her death. Her name became known to millions of people through news headlines and social media posts, but she herself, as a person, remained almost completely invisible next to the details surrounding her killer. She deserved a better ending than the one this story gave her, and she deserved to be remembered as more than just a name in a criminal cases headline, but as a person whose life ended in an alley in Chicago's Uptown neighborhood one summer night in 2022. The question this story opened with still doesn't have a final answer today. Why the justice system allowed a man who confessed to murder in his own words to walk free after just a few years in custody? Formally, there's a legal answer to that question. The distinction between first-degree murder and involuntary manslaughter, and credit for time served awaiting trial. Each of these mechanisms, taken on its own, is explainable and fits within the logic of Illinois' criminal process. But there's another, far less formal question this story leaves open for anyone who encounters it. Can a man's own confession, spoken in his own voice, end up meaning less than the technical mechanics of a criminal code that ultimately determines how that confession gets classified and what punishment it actually leads to?